All right, welcome everybody to this episode of our LogiSense podcast. Today we've got Kareem from Zoom joining us, and maybe Kareem, you can start off and talk a little bit about yourself and what Zoom's been up to.
Absolutely, happy to do so. So a little bit of introduction for me, Tim. I am at pricing at Zoom, and I focus on a lot of the AI products that we have, as well as the developer products. More generally, I've been doing pricing for about 10 years at this point, across a few different companies, so LinkedIn and Microsoft previous to this. So I've gotten a sample of kind of, mid to large companies, and everything from just doing the core licensing to understanding how implementation and rollout looks like for the field, to doing a lot of the core strategy work for product. And it's been really interesting, I think, important to kind of both do the very strategic stuff as well as the implementation stuff to get things through. And then before that was in management consulting, and even before that was actually a PhD in chemistry of all things, which was actually really helpful for getting super deep into the details and understanding products. But yeah, also happy to talk about some of the announcements that we recently made.
Yeah, absolutely. What's been going on at Zoom?
So one of the things that was really exciting that we recently announced just at the beginning of June was a product called ZoomMate. So this is effectively an AI teammate that can help you search, orchestrate, and complete work on your behalf. I've personally been dogfooding it internally for a number of months at this point, and it's been really valuable for my workflow. Just being able to understand, what's going on from a conversation, taking and synthesizing that, iterating a little bit, and then building out a finalized work product that I can then iterate on further and get to production significantly quicker than I would otherwise be able to. And I think it resonates with this broader theme that, Zoom, of course, became familiar for being the meetings company. And I think that's where we truly have our roots. But what's really important when you think about meetings is they're the starting points of what you do. You have a discussion, you come up with a number of shared understandings, and then there's always actions that you have to do after the meeting. And that's what you then need to take forward and complete. And then from a business model perspective as well, it is a hybrid seat and consumption offer where you can, of course, buy the seat and then do AI actions on top that use credits. So I think it's been very interesting to kind of work and experience that development from the ground up as well.
Nice. And I think, like you mentioned, Zoom's really been evolving, right? Like you say, it started off from a meetings and communications, collaboration side of things, but has really started to broaden its capabilities there. And I'm wondering how, that evolution of product and capabilities and offerings that you have out into market, how has that kind of, influenced your pricing philosophy as you've been going through this stuff, right? When it, early days was very seat based, right? Now you're talking about, credits. Again, I'm curious on how this evolution at Zoom has really, has changed your outlook on pricing.
So it's a great question. I would say, if you look at Zoom back in the earlier days, Zoom really stood for simplicity and transparency in terms of what you get, as well as a solid freemium offering. And as I zoom out and look, no pun intended, look at the broader industry, what's been interesting is I think a lot of those core tenets have started to roll out across competitors, and customers have started to just expect that. And I think that core of just having flexibility, transparency, and fairness, regardless of what you do, still holds. Now, when I think about AI and I look at what's going on in the broader ecosystem, with AI, there's a couple of things that start to happen. First, customers are going to be very wary about what that means. So they want to look for some easy on-ramp that they're able to understand what's going on in the product, and then be able to roll out and start to use those capabilities. Then beyond that, if you look at AI, it by itself enables you to be super powered in terms of what you're able to do, right? And our whole prior experience with software was built on this SaaS ecosystem where software was there to enable you to do good work. But just to take a meeting as an example, you can only meet for so many hours in a day, let's say 12 hours if you have a particularly long day. Somebody else who has a significantly lighter day might be at 1 or 2 hours. But there's a kind of limit of the delta in value that each is getting. With AI, that shifts completely, where all of a sudden the superpower user can just go forward and get a lot more value. And I think that's where you start to see this pivot.
Nice. And I think, like you mentioned, like there's this interesting balance between predictability, but then still wanting to only pay for the value that I'm getting from the software. And I think, what we've been seeing is that a lot of companies have been moving towards this kind of more of a hybrid pricing model that can kind of mix that committed, spend that I know that I'm going to be doing, but then also adding on more of a consumption model to add that, well, these are the things that I only want to pay for when I use them, right? And I'm interested from your side. Like you mentioned, kind of the value side of things. What do you see have been kind of like driving that push? Has it been finance departments? Has it been cost savings? Has it been like, what have you been seeing has been kind of driving that push to like having this blend of pricing?
So I think there's a few things, and maybe just to kind of get one thing off the table or on the table really quickly, I think there's been a lot of focus on, hey, why are companies doing this? I think there's another lens of this is actually good for a customer as well. So why companies are doing this, I think there's a few different reasons. But one is, again, just getting back to this idea that AI is a step change in terms of what you can do, because now the product does the work for you in a way that you haven't been able to before. And when you automate, you can just do so much more. So if you're thinking about the value that I as a user can get, that is just significantly higher once you factor in AI. So how do you think about actually sharing the value that you get out of that? And that's where I think some type of consumption-based model, and the model can vary, but that's why like a consumption-based model is a really good way for everyone to share in the upside that a customer sees. Then the other side is for the customers. I think customers are really used to, like, everyone is familiar with, hey, I purchase a seat, I get a defined amount of value. What also happens is, and you can see this in news articles everywhere, people will buy a whole bunch of seats and then they'll sit and they won't be necessarily like super activated, and they'll effectively be shelfware. And you're paying a decent amount for that shelfware. But with a shift towards more of a consumption-based model, what I think is interesting is now you can actually clarify that and simplify that. So people, if they don't want to get a ton of value, or if they can't get a ton of value out of it, they don't pay as much. And if they are getting significant value in those kind of cases where you have a power user, the 5 or 10% of users, that's where they're paying for the value. But the customer isn't, again, paying for all those other users who aren't using the product a significant amount. Then there's the other side, which frankly is unsurprising. If you look at the token costs that Anthropic and OpenAI roll out every once in a while, they are significant. And there's been a lot of reports with Anthropic's latest one, Mythos. It's going to be a budget buster because, yes, it can find and patch security vulnerabilities at a speed that is frankly beyond what humans are even able to do. But it also can rack up your bills at a speed that like no humans and potentially even high-priced engineers are not able to do. So that's why I think you're starting to see that big shift.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, right? Because like the value exchange when it comes to pricing AI, it's just a much different conversation. And I think one of the challenges when pricing this, and like the examples that you were just giving there, right, is that my infrastructure costs are variable, right? They're variable based off of the models that I'm using. They're variable based off of the value that's coming out of those different scenarios, right? And I'm curious on kind of how you're thinking about pricing AI, where those experiences are fairly priced, but at the same point, as a business, you need to protect your margins that they don't go running off. I saw an article today that was from GitHub that was talking about they were just eating a ton of long-running costs just from a per seat model, and now they're having that pay against the credits, and now people are seeing the credits just disappear so quickly out of it. So I'm curious on your thoughts on kind of that fairness of pricing, but at the same point protecting your margins that you need on your infrastructure.
So I actually did want to raise the GitHub example, and I love that you raised it. Let's dive into that one for a second because I think it's worth it. So GitHub was basically a flat price model, and they shifted over to a consumption model. And as they did that, I think there were some things that they did for simplicity. But basically, this is a story you're seeing again and again. They make this shift, and it really kind of lays bare the difference between the people who are power users and the people who are light users. And I actually think it's a really instructive and interesting example. There's one side of this, which is kind of the, morality side of it, of like, hey, like, you users who are heavily using this product, like, you should be paying more. And you users who are using this product, and, frankly, as I personally do with my personal Claude and ChatGPT accounts, will just use the highest performing model for anything and everything that I possibly can. You end up racking the bill up, and you can aim for, these very high bills. But I think there's also this other side, which is there's a clear and expressed user need for simplicity that they're looking for there. Do I, as a user, want to see all the time and make these conscious decisions all the time of like, should I be going with this really expensive model, or should I be going with this other thing? I don't know if you've seen the latest with Claude, but like, they have 8 different calibration models for just Opus 4.8. And then in addition to that, you have like this whole menu of like 7 or 8 different models that they have available, from Opus, Haiku, Sonnet class, with like the prior 3 versions of those as well. Like, I don't want to think about that every time that I open up my slide, or I open up my window. I want to be able to do something similar to ChatGPT, where I go in and it just has 2 choices. Do you want thinking, or do you want instant? And then 90% of use cases are taken care of by that. So I think that's one piece, is there's a missing opportunity here that I think GitHub somewhat flubbed, of just like providing the tools to make things easier. And that's, I think, a core thing that I'll maybe touch on a little bit more. Users want predictability. That is, I think, the thing that's driving this. It's not, I really don't like consumption-based pricing. It's, you took this model where I was used to getting a fixed price or having clarity on what I was going to pay. You upended this, and now I'm 10xing or 100xing my costs, and I've burned out of all the value that I'm getting. So how do we offer predictability as you're switching from one model to another, and giving users a little bit of runway to understand what that looks like? I can't recall who exactly this was, but there's some companies, I think HubSpot did this, where they gave users a little bit of runway to see like, hey, we're not going to be charging for credits, but you're going to get view into what your credits are actually doing. And we're going to roll you over at this very specific time so that you see what's going on. And then on the other side is like just in product and over, as you're like showing things on the, as you're like showing people what they're doing, you just need to give clarity about like, hey, even if we can't say exactly how much you're going to use, here's roughly what you're going to be using. So you aren't surprised again at the end of the day when your bill is higher than you expect, that it is higher than you expect. So I think this puts a new onus on the users. Happy to talk about the margin side of this as well, if you want to go there.
Yeah, well, and I guess I think it really just, it comes back to what you said earlier, right? Like, how can I, in the simplest way possible, show a direct line between what I'm paying and the value that I'm getting, right? And yes, every finance department is running on budgets. There's a budget amount set aside for this. Is it or is it not going to go exceed or go under the budget that I have allocated here for it, right? And I think, like you said, that's that predictability of understanding, from what I'm paying, this is the value that I'm going to get out of what I'm paying. And if that's aligned really well and I'm getting super value out of it, then let it run, right? Versus I don't really know how much value I'm getting, so it's a much harder way for people to be able to say, how's that fit in that budget? So, and I think that's really around that predictability. How do you manage that predictability with your customer, right?
Totally. And I guess like to add into that, what's been funny is, I don't know, I can't remember who had the quote, but like, history never repeats itself, but it rhymes. This just reminds me a lot of what you saw with like AWS and Azure. Like, I was back in Microsoft back in the day when like Azure was seeing exactly these same things. And I remember there was a report from The Information talking about people shocked at their like AWS bill. and complaining and wanting to understand where things were. And you saw this exact same trend where people start out and they're like, this is incredible. Like I can just like push things to the cloud and I don't have to worry about anything. I can push things to AI and it can be way more productive. And you see the reports of, Facebook employees, like AWS employees, like not only like, to coin the term, token maxing, using as many tokens as they possibly can, just like because they can be so innovative and like creative because of that, but also just being incentivized from the product teams to do that, to now this hard swing towards we need predictability. And that's, I think, that we saw something that we saw very clearly, with the infrastructure companies back in the day, and we have started seeing to an early degree in the industry right now.
Yeah. And I think like what we've been seeing is it's not necessarily seeing, but the chatter that's out there, right, is everybody, I think, is looking to try to find ways to align the value and predictability. And some of those different suggestions out there have been around outcome-based pricing, right? Because then I can at least draw a line to what I'm getting specifically, that's the outcome that I'm looking for across these different pieces. But outcome is, while it sounds easy and measurable, it has its own challenges there as well. And I'm curious what you're seeing from your customers or any requests or the market around demand for outcome-based pricing and what your thoughts are around that.
Yeah, so outcome-based pricing, I think, is one of those things that has been super hyped up. This is more a 2025 era thing, I would say, where everyone is like, hey, like everything's going to go to outcomes, like we're going to do outcomes. And then basically what people realized end of 2025 and into early 2026 is outcome-based pricing is the future and it always will be, right? So here's my kind of take on it. I think there is value in outcome-based pricing. I think it is a solution sometimes in need of a problem. But I think the broader problem that exists is people want to be able to tie the value, and we said this before, the value that they're getting to the cost that they're actually paying. Outcome-based pricing is one version of this, and I think it works really well in specific areas. The framework that I personally love is Kyle Poirot's CAMP test. So is there a consistent definition of what success looks like? Is it attributable to you? Is it measurable? So can I actually go in and see that this thing has happened? And then can I predict how many of these events that I'm going to have? And a great example of where this works awesomely is something like support tickets. Yeah. If I go in and file a support ticket, like I've been running, I don't personally, but software companies run support programs and have for ages. Other companies are running support programs and have for ages. They are very keenly aware of exactly how many support tickets they bring in. They are keenly aware of the costs that they are spending on an individual user perspective for a human agent to pick up the phone and answer that, or type on a chat in chat to answer a question. There's a lot of measurement there, and there's a very clear definition. Same to some degree, I think, for like sales leads and that kind of thing, which is why you see traction there. But where it breaks down is if you're going to be an input. So for example, if I'm building a slide deck, like I don't know what the slide deck is for. It might just be some internal presentation. It might be a pitch that's going to happen. I have no idea what that's going to be. Or if you're doing, for example, something where there is a clear success, but the payoff is delayed, or there's like difficulty in attribution. So a good example is hiring. So for example, if I hire somebody because there was a recommendation engine that said, hey, go and look at these specific people. So LinkedIn recently announced, for example, a service that enables you to do this, LinkedIn Hiring Agent. Like it's really hard to be able to connect that hiring event that might happen weeks or months later to some software program suggesting this broad pool of candidates that you then bring forward, right? And then there's a whole debate of like, I don't know who actually suggests this. But maybe to pivot this, I think what people are again looking for is they want to be able to tie like returns on investment. So I need to understand what the return is to the initial investment that I made on a very granular basis. And this is where I think instead of looking purely at outputs, which is the absolute last part of that value chain, look a little bit further to look at outcome-based or value-aligned pricing. So instead of going in and charging on a per token basis, can I actually pivot this to charge, for example, as the API, as a lot of the image APIs do, for example, of charging you for delivering an actual image. Or if you look at, I believe this is like where HubSpot is navigating to, or where Figma is navigating to, doing a specific task, taking an edit, something like that, something that is very tangible that I, as a user, understand and can process much more than I can like, hey, you consumed like 50,000 tokens. And I'm like, I have no idea what 50,000 tokens is. The same, and you guys come from the telco space, of like consuming like 5 megabits of information for like getting a website, right? Like, I have no idea what that value means.
The old days of AOL, right? On those ones when you're being priced on how many megabytes that you're downloading, right? So
100%.
Like, and I think it's really interesting, right? Like there's this tug of war between, outcome really exasperates the tug of war. There's a tug of war of value that the customer is trying to get from the solution, and the tug of war from the service provider that needs to provide that solution with margin, right? And the cost infrastructure, because like even those good examples that you give, and I agree 100% with the examples that you give, right? Closing a ticket. Well, did it take 30 interactions back and forth against my model to close it, or did it take 200? And there's a variable cost of infrastructure that I have there as a service provider to still provide that same positive outcome that I would be charging against. And I think that's why people revert back into tokens and some of these other things, because I still have infrastructure costs that I need to be able to manage. And I'm curious on your thoughts around like, how do you deal with that sort of scenario in these value-based conversations?
So I think there's 2 lenses of this. There's the margin side, which I'll dive into right now, and then I'm happy to get into the value side of this, since I have some thoughts about kind of how you define value. The first thing I'm just going to start with is we're very much in the early innings of this, and as we get through and see what customers, I think there's a number of things that need to resolve. Number one is there's a very volatile cost situation we see now. There's a question around customer value that we're trying to kind of parse out. And then at the same time, there's kind of customer expectations. And all of these pieces are moving. I should also add in, of course, competitors are adjusting to this and you need to compete. But we need to figure out how do we kind of move these pieces and understand that we're not in a stable equilibrium yet. And again, getting back to the history points, I am old enough to remember an era where you had to pay for the number of minutes that you had, and you had to pay for the amount of data that you used. What happened in that era and how did things change? Because I think that's very instructive to looking forward. What happened is back in the AOL days, I still remember you had these dial tones that you had to have where like for about a minute, your modem made this serious sound of connecting. If anybody is young enough where they don't remember this, and I'm absolutely doing this for my kids at some points, you should go onto YouTube and just like play like the connecting tone for like AOL. And it has this very distinct, very interesting music that probably can be like synth or something. But the point being, you were connecting over a phone line of which there weren't that many, and there was a very specific infrastructure. Telco companies got like super involved and spent just like a crazy amount of money building out all this infrastructure and just drove down the value or the cost of delivering these internet speeds by hundreds, or I guess by like at least like a few orders of magnitude, probably 5. I have no idea exactly what it is now, but at least like 5 or so orders of magnitude. And what you saw in that is it completely transformed what was possible and the business models that people had. So for example, Tim, like you remember for cell phones, I think just before this, to pull the analogy, you took the example of BlackBerry and trying to connect and get reception to be able to demonstrate a data product that I suspect was basically just barely sipping any information. So maybe sending a text, which they were probably like metered at that time. I can't remember exactly what BlackBerry's business model was. To now where like you have this era where I just go on, I buy the unlimited plan from T-Mobile, which every single plan is unlimited. And the only question is basically like, what other value do you get? I expect to see a very similar thing here where like costs will be driven down, and pulling this back into AI. Like we're again very much in that early like AOL era phase where you're paying for the amount of time that you're online or the bits that you're sending. What I expect to have happen is this might look similar to semiconductors, where you see there's a leading edge semiconductor or like LLM that keeps getting more and more and more expensive. And it doesn't get like super, super expensive over time, but like it kind of increases over time. The number of rounds and revs that you have to do kind of increases. And for the most advanced tasks, like finding, exploiting, and patching security like issues, you want the absolute best for that. At some point, just to take the outcome-based pricing example, you can answer a service ticket with a fairly simple model, and the cost of those are dropping dramatically, and the efficiency you have is dropping dramatically. So you can kind of take an off-ramp at some point and say, hey, the 4.0 level model or GPT 4.0 level model that is 100 or 1,000x cheaper than it was when it first rolled out might be good enough for 80% of situations, and you start to get that routing. And that's where you start to get margin, right? Which then I think takes you to the value question, which is like, okay, how exactly do you price value? And maybe to throw a hot take in there, I think a lot of the value-based conversations that I hear right now are not necessarily super on points. Because honestly, I can make a persuasive argument for here's how much value you get end user because you are not having to do this given task as a human. And I think that makes sense for right now. But in 6 months' time, when 5 competitors are offering exactly the same thing, you can't still be like, hey, look at all the savings you got because you're not doing this. That used to cost you $10. So me coming in for a measly $1 is like a great savings, right? In the same way that like going in and like reconstructing and getting information by dialing like I forget what the number was, like 411 or something, to talk to a human agent was like a massive time saving. If you can just jump to a website, like great, that makes a ton of sense right now, but in 6 months it won't. So I think like it actually might be better to start to look at like cost-based pricing to some degree right now and start to hash out like what is the distinct value that I have, similar to what Clay did when they split their model to kind of take away the LLM side of it from LLM and data side of it from like the unique workflow stuff that they're delivering.
Yeah, there's so many analogies that I was thinking as you were talking there, right? It's just like, it's the infamous, I don't know if you're a Seinfeld fan, but if you've got 5-minute abs workout, well, what happens when someone comes up with 4-minute abs, right? Like, it's just like, well, now you're in a different spot. But I see it like 100%, right?
100%.
We saw this, like, I really like your analogies. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. But we saw the same sort of thing when the first smartphones were coming out as well, right? Like, the reason that carriers and everybody's loved BlackBerry is because they were the most efficient use of the network possible. And then AT&T went and launched the first IP-based networks that were all you could eat for iPhones. And that just got rid of that infrastructure cost and that barrier as a challenge, right? And I think, I see exactly what you're getting at here, right? Like from the AI perspective, we haven't hit that turning point yet of where it starts to come back down. Or in the other analogy that you give, like I look at 5G network. Do I really use 5G more than 4G right now? No, it's not really any faster for the things that I use on my device. So is the value really in a faster model there, or is it then just become commoditized from just an overall same thing? Like, I'm paying unlimited per month through my my phone now, and it doesn't matter how much data that I'm consuming because it kind of all evens out. But like, I think there's a lot of really good, points and ways of thinking in there, because that's really that challenge on trying to get to that value and that margin. Like when I look at, say, our customers that are looking at us from like a billing solution,
Well, so
they want to see like 70% of the value is what we're offering. 30% is the volume of the data that we're processing through the system. The real value is in our accurate bills and our flexibility. The value is in the product offering, not in the volume. It's just seen as cost. It's just a cost of doing business. And I don't think we've hit that. Like you said, we haven't hit that turning point yet for AI, but it will turn to just being a cost of doing business versus the forefront of the pricing of the value that you're getting out of the solution. So
actually that highlights a couple of first fun anecdotes, and apologies, I love my anecdotes. But I think anecdotes and an important insight here. So I remember when you mentioned 5G, so for a little bit of context, I was in management consulting before this. I was working with a large semiconductor company, and we were looking more forward-looking. What are the things that look like in the future? 5G and the evolution on 5G on both the like cell phone tower infrastructure side of things, as well as on the phone, or I guess base station for the folks who are very into the lingo here, versus like what's happening on the phone itself, were quite interesting. And you started to see the same dynamics there. Another place where this came up, which I thought was quite interesting, is I remember vividly being in a Best Buy when I was, trying to buy my next TV for my grandmother. And I don't have great eyesight, right? I'm wearing these, glasses, which are quite thick. I'm like fortunate if I can like look into the distance and like fully see an image. I'm making things, being a little bit exaggerating, but what I remember is standing in that Best Buy, and they'd recently come out with like what was it, 1080p TV, and I can't remember what the one was before that, where you could actually see a difference if you're sitting far away. And or I think it was 1080p, and then they had like 4K or
4K,
whatever. Yeah, so they're showing this 4K screen. I'm standing at what I think is like the rough distance between the couch and like the TV, and I'm looking, and this like Best Buy salesperson is just like going over and just waxing poetic about like all the virtues of like 4K and how you can't even see any changes or anything. And I'm sure this guy has like perfect eyesight. He's just like talking, and I'm looking at it. I'm just like squinting between like the 1080p and the 4K TV. Just like, I'm sorry, man, I can't see a difference between these things.
Yeah.
And I think it was another important signal to your point of, you need to stay in the game. If you're in the SaaS business right now, you need to stay in the game and be able to deliver the value that you can. And we all have to just realize that as costs come down, the place where we thought we were delivering value right now is actually going to be changing significantly. Because you might think that your product is delivering value because, to take the ticketing example, it can answer a question quicker and more efficiently and with higher conversion rates or what have you than what a human agent is able to do, or the average human agent is able to do. What you might realize a little bit down the line is actually the value that you're delivering is something completely different than that, and can be up-leveled as those costs start to come down and completely new use cases that you couldn't even think of start to come about. So a great example or analogy there is, Uber, and Uber was like this outshoot of having like this kind of existing phone infrastructure where you could get access to mobile phone data anywhere on a smartphone that was like very capable and high powered. No one would have thought that like taxis would have been at risk a while in the past.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that when it comes back again, he said it all comes back to value. And what have you been seeing around, like, when you're looking at your pricing strategy and getting that value to your customers? What are the things that you're thinking of on there around customer retention, right? There's the winning the net new customer, but how does that pricing the thought process that you put through it, looking around like reducing churn, right, keeping customer retention, and renewal times, and what's your thought process as you're going through and structuring your pricing that way?
Yeah, so I think if you look out at the industry, first I'll talk briefly about the SaaS side of this, and then I'll kind of move forward to AI. If you look at the industry, what you see is just historically what there's been is people will kind of buy the product, and you have this conversation in future of like, hey, here's all this value that you've gotten if you're like really on top of things. Here's how many users have been using the product. And you kind of like try to get some number of seats landed and go in with like an upsell opportunity. And basically like utilization is going to be one of the core metrics that you look at. What's interesting is this actually looks fundamentally different in more of an AI consumption-based model, where you have to kind of always be selling both directly when you go in for those renewal conversations every year or every couple of years. But you also have to be selling all the time. And this is something that I think if you look at a lot of the infrastructure companies, they've already had to be doing. Right? Your churn and your revenue gain by upsell actually happens all the time. So you have to land the customer and get them to buy the seat. That is their first experience. But then, especially if you're working through credits, you have to be delivering value constantly and encouraging them to bring up new use cases that they see value from, so that they increase the amount of usage that they have, which is a massive upside opportunity. It shifts the conversation on churn completely from just, I don't need you to only buy, I need you to actually use and increase your usage. But it means that you also have to have a significantly more on-point experience from a customer success perspective, from the like usage and sharing of usage perspective, and from a sales engagement perspective. And I think that's what you see if you look at the model from more of those infrastructure companies.
Right. I think and I've heard, I can't remember, I heard from before is, right, like even from an AI strategy, and what people have been talking about kind of longer term is, instead of thinking of it as a net new product offering that you're going, in some cases, how does using it increase the use of your core product, right? How does it and create more demand and full use of the whole system? What are the new features that you're adding to encourage more contact points, more use of the system, more continual pull of value out of that contract that I have with my vendor, right? And that's that constantly, you said, you're always selling, you're always improving, always trying to find more ways for them to be able to use your product on that. And I'm curious of where you see, kind of the future of pricing going along these lines, or any kind of advice that you might have for companies out there that need to start thinking more modern pricing strategy, modern ways of thinking about it. Because that was a really interesting insight around thinking about how you're building, like the whole, everything in your pricing and product is all one thing you need to be thinking about. And I'm curious on your thoughts of where you see this sort of pricing and these scenarios going.
So I think it's a great question. The first thing, which is probably going to be a slightly unsettling answer for most folks, is I don't think anyone knows. The only thing that we can have for certain is that we need to be prepared for flexibility. So to add a little bit more to that, I think, again, let's start with the customer and work out from there. What customers are always looking for is going to be predictability, fairness, simplicity, value delivered. They want to start there. How that actually looks ends up differing depending upon what's available in the market, what are products capable of in general, what's coming down the pike as far as product value, and how do you get to that over time? And the challenge is, I think, I like to use historical analogies. I actually don't necessarily think there's a historical analogy for how rapidly things are changing. You just have extremely capable models of which we've managed to integrate a very slim fraction of the amount of capabilities. Agents, just as an example, weren't even really a thing beyond a talking point in 2025. And by early 2026, it went from, yeah, there's these agent things, and agentic is a thing that we're going to get to early 2026. That showed up and just took the world by storm. And you saw this flip from ChatGPT to Claude as the primary driving infrastructure for the businesses, along with a commensurate shift in, who is kind of leading in terms of revenues. I think it's an indication of a couple of things. First, things are going to be moving extremely fast. So don't over optimize for kind of solving the existing problem. I think the bitter lesson is the great example that, I like to look at a bunch of different blogs. Stratechery from Ben Thompson is kind of the point where this is coming about. You shouldn't over optimize for what you're doing right now, the value that you're delivering right now, because that will quickly change. And you just need to be kind of prepared and ready to adapt as AI computing takes on completely new capabilities. And what you think has happened might shift pretty quickly. You need to have a thumb on the, or I guess like a finger in the wind of like what's going on in the marketplace so you can very quickly adapt and pivot. That means you need to have pricing infrastructure that is ready to support experimentation and testing, in addition to just your desire to do so. And then you need to kind of see where things are right now and where things are pivoting. You need to also be driving for simplicity and predictability for customers as they're looking at this. So even if you go to hybrid, which I think, at least for right now, is the answer that makes most sense, what does that actually mean as it's being rolled out and implemented? And how do you make sure that is actually executable again, not only by the product itself or the pricing system, but by your go-to-market team, who also will have additional capabilities and benefits and limitations that you see across the world in SaaS, where they're used to showing up, for example, explaining, here's the seat, here's the good offer, here's the better offer, here's the best offer. I might not get you to the best, but let's get you to the better. And then disappearing for 1 to 3 years and then showing up again. What do all of those different components look like, and place them together so that you can get to kind of a clear, successful outcome?
Awesome. That is a fantastic set of advice for our audience. So I think that's maybe a really great spot to be able to end this podcast. That's like I said, really, really sage advice. Really enjoyed your commentary on these topics, Kareem. Really appreciate you for coming and joining us on this podcast.
Awesome, Tim. Really appreciate it for having me on. I will also just say, if I can just make a pitch for kind of 3 places where I get most of my information, since
for sure
being in touch with the news is really critical, or maybe 4. So just from a broad tech perspective, Stratechery from Ben Thompson, as well as Benedict Evans' newsletter, I think have been a place where I've gained a lot of information. Benedict Evans just recently released a very good report that kind of covers a lot of the trends that you're seeing at a high level. And then just from a pricing specific perspective, I closely follow Rob Litter's Good, Better, Best. So I've been gaining a lot of value from that. And then like myself, I've just been as deep into these various products to kind of understand what's going on kind of on the ground, as well as just in the ecosystem more broadly. So I actually have a newsletter that I've like kind of got set up that gets pulled automatically for myself to kind of get an assessment of what's going on in the broader industry from a pricing perspective. So just in the nature of getting very close to what's going on.
Awesome. Great things to follow. I know Rob's I've had lots of good conversations with Rob in the past as well. Great source of information there. So again, thanks again, Kareem. Enjoyed the conversation, and we'll have to chat again soon.
Awesome. Really appreciate it, Tim. Have a good one.